Europe needs the capacity to act in its own right, independent of the US. Trump and the leadership around him are way more transactional. I don't think it's necessarily isolationist, but I do think there is way less attachment to Europe. The cold, hard reality of European cash going into US defence firms is a degree of leverage. It prevents a total disengagement. The unipolar moment is past. The US needs partners and allies. It is a huge advantage over Russia and China. People will work with Russia and China. They can be bought by Russia and China. There aren't that many countries that actively like them. If Europe is going to spend more on defence, it needs to take a hard look at the areas where it currently has a significant dependency on the US and begin to invest in its own capabilities.
Welcome to this episode of the Disorder Podcast, a podcast that tries to make sense of this mad world. I'm Arthur Snell, one of the co-hosts on this podcast, and I'm delighted that this episode is part of our ongoing collaboration with RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. My guest today is Dr. Matthew Savill, who is Director of Military Sciences at RUSI, and in that capacity he's an expert on military technology in its current and evolving futures. His background is very interesting. He worked inside British government service for many years in the Ministry of Defence and also in various locations in the Middle East. Matthew and I had an opportunity to talk about the impact that the war in Ukraine has had on military technology and what that means particularly for European powers as America starts to withdraw its military presence in Europe, and those countries in Europe that have for years over-depended on American security guarantees have to start investing and looking after their own security. Well, thank you for joining us on the Disorder Podcast. This is a podcast where we try to understand the disorder of the current world and also explore ways in which order might be found. Clearly, your area of expertise, military science, military technology, is one that feels very current, and perhaps most glaring example being the war in Ukraine and the way in which warfare has been arguably transformed in a short space of time, in just 3 years, really. I suppose I'd like to start with that question. Is it true that the war in Ukraine has transformed modern warfare?
I mean, this is the question which we spend so much of our time discussing, indeed arguing over. There's always a bit of caution when we draw lessons from Ukraine in that we are looking at a specific case study with two particular adversaries who have come to this war with militaries that they're now trying to change. And there is this battle of capability and countermeasure and then response. And a lot of our research is drawing lessons from Ukraine, but we try and do it from other examples, looking at the Middle East, things that have happened before Ukraine and since in other places, to make sure that what we aren't doing is just describing what's happening in Ukraine and then automatically assuming that's what all future war will be looked like. So there's this, that is the big caveat. And I should say that we look across the board. So we have something that is largely, in terms of the numbers of personnel, it is a land war. But obviously we are looking at the use of air power, the interaction between air and land power, maritime power. Many of our colleagues here are looking at cyber activity, the impact of sanctions, what you might call economic warfare and statecraft. So there's a lot to be drawn outside of the clash of arms on the land. That enormous preamble takes us to a point where I think we would say certain aspects of modern warfare are changing significantly in terms of it becoming obvious what can or can't be done, particularly with uncrewed systems. But what we're also looking at is what you can achieve with marrying up your sensors and your networks to accelerate the speed at which you can make decisions, target each other. We have had reminders about certain aspects of warfare that I think some in the West and in NATO have, if you like, forgotten about, or really they haven't forgotten them, but they neglected them because they weren't as important. Electronic warfare is a part of that. So we are getting a reminder that once you start a war, the nature of war as a violent conflict between people is pretty constant, but that character will change as a consequence of the combatants. But yes, there's a lot to learn from Ukraine. We just need to not overinterpret it.
How many of the changes that you've seen coming out of the Ukraine war are ones that you hadn't foreseen prior to that war starting?
Well, I mean, there's a question about before the war started, I was working in the MODs. There's an awful lot that we did or didn't foresee about it. I think in terms of the trends, I would say that the team at RUSI and a lot of other excellent analysts have been talking for some time now about the potential for uncrewed systems to play a larger role. And examples of that have been seen in recent conflicts. A lot of people look at the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but in truth, we saw the use of small systems to drop explosive devices in Mosul nearly a decade ago, when Islamic State was using commercial or toy drones bought off the shelves, attaching grenades and dropping them on Iraqi forces. And the potential for first-person view drones, essentially a drone that is controlled by a user who is wearing a heads-up display and it's sort of seeing through the eyes of the drone, that's been identified previously. I think that's one of the areas where you have got an acceleration in the utility of these weapons that is part driven by imagination and people being innovative in thinking about how they can produce these, and also the pressure of war and the need to compensate for deficiencies elsewhere, driving the increased use. So one of the big debates is, are drones of different types making older weapons systems or capabilities obsolete? And I think the view of my team is no. Things like armoured vehicles and tanks are not obsolete. But if you're Ukrainian, you have a lack of some of these systems, and so you need to use more drones. And what that has been married to is Ukrainian industry and external funding and industrial support, rapidly increasing the scale at which these weapons can be produced. And I think that is something that the Western NATO really needs to look at, which is how do you increase the scale of production of certain weapons and do it at a very efficient price point.
I want to throw that question perhaps to the Russian side as well, because obviously we know that Ukraine had the deficiency, particularly armoured vehicles, especially at the early stages of the war. It's been operating basically without an air force for much of this time, or conventional air force anyway. Russia has also made extensive use of drones, but Russia was better equipped, albeit with some of its tanks are sort of museum pieces. Is there something different happening in the way Russia is using drones, or is it that they're actually in a certain way sort of Russia and Ukraine are kind of following each other?
Well, there are multiple, if you like, drone battles going on, because when we say drone or uncrewed system, we are talking about a really wide variety of weapons. I know some of my team get quite annoyed with the use of the term drone because it covers everything from something that is handheld and used for surveillance to some of the FPV drones, which are guided by fibre optic cable, are really the modern version of an anti-tank guided missile. And a lot of what the Russians are using, these bigger drones that some people call one-way attack drones, the Shahed, which is now the Geran in Russian service.
So this is classically the Iranian-designed and now Russian-produced sort of flying bomb, basically.
Right. Well, you could say that's a cruise missile. Basically, it is a powered warhead which is directed to a target. It's a cruise missile. What the Russians are doing is they are part of the tactical battle down near the front, where drones are increasingly being used to create a zone expanding backwards from the point of contact to create this pretty deadly area where it's pretty easy to be spotted and people can then call in more drones to attack you or strike with artillery. Then you have the long-range attack drones. And the main difference there is that the Russians have got a bit of a more industrial program going at the moment. The Ukrainians have been launching very long-range drones. We're talking 1,000 kilometres for 18 months, maybe 2 years now. And some of those are converted light aircraft. Some of what they're experimenting with look like flying bombs, or they've taken target drones from the West, or they are creating their own explicit cruise missiles. But the Russians have got a slight head start in the industrial capacity that they are now pumping out these Gerans at potentially a couple of thousand a month so that they can increase the scale of the attacks that they are launching at Ukraine. So that's one of the big differences. They also seem to be slightly ahead on the front line on the use of FPV drones. What's interesting there is the success with those drones on the front line has been mostly on the defensive. So the Ukrainians have put up what they call their drone line or the drone wall. That is to compensate for the fact that in some areas of the front line, they are very, very lightly staffed with, people in trenches or bolt holes. There's a small number of people holding a very large, wide frontage, and they're able to do that because they have got a lot of drones on call to spot Russian soldiers and then attack them.
Yeah, and that's on one level reflects the one thing where there is an absolutely clear asymmetry is clearly the Russians can deploy larger numbers of people into the battlefield. One of the things about this is that I suppose throughout history, war has driven innovation, and we could, I'm sure you've got a lot of sort of interesting examples of that. But what we're seeing in the Ukraine context is the innovation perhaps also then reflecting the capabilities of the state involved. But so what I'm getting at here is that Ukraine is not really in a position to start building fighter jets. So it has ended up putting a lot of its innovation energies into these uncrewed systems. And something that we hear said, perhaps casually by people who don't know as much as you do, Matthew, is that, well, the issue is that when the West builds a drone, it takes 3 years and it's going to cost, I don't know, $20 million. Or it might take, let's say it takes 10 years, whereas the Ukrainians are doing it, very rapidly, and they're a few $100s, and it reflects the realities of modern warfare. Now, is that a fair... this is the sort of thing you might hear in a pub in Wiltshire. Is that fair? Is that correct? And do we have a problem in the West that we certainly don't lack technical know-how, but we've got the wrong kind of defence industry to deal with this new kind of warfare?
It's a very mixed picture. And I think there is definitely some criticism from inside Ukraine of some of the Western supplied drones, and in many respects necessity has driven dozens and dozens of cottage industries inside Ukraine producing these weapons at large scale very rapidly. The slight problem there is that a significant part of that supply chain rests on parts from China. They're not necessarily very rugged. One of the challenges to the narrative about the ubiquity of drones is how many are being used in order to achieve the effect that we see on a small number of videos. Right. The irony is that a lot of the drones the Ukrainians are using have been supplied by Western companies, or Western money in industry is supporting it. You have partnerships. So what we don't have is Western militaries that are set up to really understand how to use these drones. And I think one of the challenges, one of my team is writing about this at the moment, is NATO militaries shouldn't necessarily bet the farm on a drone force to beat Russia, given two things. One, Ukrainian industry and supporters have got a target of several million drones to be produced this year of different types, and they might be able to hit that target, but they're not winning hitting that target. And the other thing is that Russia has increasingly got very good at counter-drone capabilities in the broad sense. I mean, they're taking horrendous casualties, but their understanding and use of electronic warfare and netting and camouflage and shields and everything from, shotguns up to something that's quite sophisticated is pretty extensive. And so NATO's saying, if you look at the numbers that NATO is talking about buying some of these weapons in terms of quantities, NATO is somehow saying, well, we'll buy 10% of what the Ukrainians have, and somehow we'll throw that against a now experienced counter-drone force in the form of the Russians, and somehow we'll do better with it. That doesn't make much sense. Yeah. What we need to do is work out how to integrate drones alongside our current capabilities where we do have an advantage, for example, in our air power, in some of our deep strike. The challenge for NATO is that a huge proportion of that capability is vested in American capabilities, not Europeans. So we've created a dependency.
So, and I'm asking lots of unfair questions here, Matthew, but the next unfair question is, given what NATO has, which is a very sophisticated, if what you might call traditional air force with fighter jets, including the most capable ones in the world, F-35, Typhoon and so on, Rafale, is that a better thing to have if you were going to make a choice between that or what the Ukrainians have, which is absent a classic air force? They've created this new drone capability.
Yes, I think you asked earlier what was predicted. I think what wasn't predicted in particular is the curious case of the Russian Air Force, which has not achieved air superiority, but it does provide this platform for launching lots of these other long-range strikes on Ukraine, where Ukrainians are going to invest an enormous amount in defence. There will be work that will go into why is the VKS, the Russian Air Force, operating in the way that it has? But if you look at the advantage that the West has, the big thing that we have, if you include US air power, is our ability to probably gain air superiority then attack Russian ground-based air defences, push those back or destroy them or suppress them. And then at that point, we suddenly have a large range of air capabilities which offset Russian numbers on the ground. We can strike them from the air and really hurt their forces as they attempt to manoeuvre. And Ukrainians don't have a conventional air force that can do that, although they've got 16s, they've got their own Soviet-era aircraft launching cruise missiles, but they're not providing air superiority with that. So what they have done is create, drones and a drone force that are being used to complicate Russian manoeuvre on the ground very successfully. But they haven't got that effective massed deep strike. I think this is one of the things that is really important, in that we talk about how thick the drone cover is, but the firepower it can bring to bear at a particular moment in time. It's not quick in the same way that massed artillery is, and it doesn't have the same punching power that lots of air-to-ground missiles have, although those are expensive. So no, NATO wouldn't want to say, well, let's give up all of our F-35s or 15s armed with a large range of missiles for drones, because at the moment drones are not going to duplicate the punching power, range and penetration that those systems do.
So that's interesting. So it sounds as though, and I'm certainly not suggesting complacency, but it sounds as though you believe that NATO's kind of classic advantage that it had over Russia, which is having basically less sort of mass on the ground, but much more capable in the air, and that ability to create air superiority, which is a sort of classic NATO approach, that you believe that would still hold good?
Yes, it would. But I think the area where NATO, well, there are many areas where NATO really needs to pick up the pace. First of all, launching those air attacks is going to be challenging, and we're learning a lot about the need for the use of airborne electronic warfare, decoys, things to suppress Russian air defences. That will absolutely need to be sustained as a NATO advantage. NATO land forces are going to need to think hard about how they bring firepower to bear. If I took the British Army as an example, the problem there is it's very small and it doesn't have a lot of further reaching firepower. I mean, we've given up our self-propelled artillery, the AS-90, to give that to Ukraine. We have a very small number of Archer self-propelled guns as a stopgap, but there is a classic piece of self-propelled artillery coming in down the line. We need to know how to defend those, because that is where Russians and Ukrainians are using drones to snipe, if you like, each other's artillery. But also we've got to improve how quickly we can detect and bring our firepower to bear. So that is an area where the Russians are now very good on the ground. Their speed at which they can identify something and then select either drones or classic artillery and strike it has accelerated massively over the past 3 years. And so we need to duplicate that acceleration. And that is something that the British Army is looking at. It's started something called Project Asgard to improve its use of sensors and weapons. Like NATO land forces in particular cannot be complacent about this, because otherwise they're going to walk into a fight where they would be spotted and attacked more rapidly than they can respond. This conversation that we're having, and clearly I don't think anyone would be surprised to hear that NATO land forces have got a lot of sort of capability gaps. We still have to talk about what is definitely the elephant in the room, which is the fact that it is very clear that the US is heading into an isolationist turn. And of course, we can talk about President Trump, but we know that this has been a trajectory. We can go back to the Obama years and we can find statements made both by Obama and his defense secretaries that pointed to an increasing impatience with Europe, similarly with Biden, but that has just accelerated immensely under Trump. Of course, recent NATO summits, one might say that Trump recommitted to the sort of mutual defense clauses of NATO. I think a lot of NATO members might feel that you sort of in the watches of the night, they might wonder just how sort of genuine that commitment is. So at the same time, of course, European militaries are supposed to be expanding rapidly, budgets growing. Again, we could argue about 3.5 versus 5%, the questions about infrastructure, but it's still loads more money than there was 10 years ago. Where do you see this going, particularly in your area of specialism, in terms of military technology, military science? If you imagine, it's almost as if
you've got sort of two vessels. One has got a leak and it's gradually draining away, and that's the sort of American commitment to Europe. And the other is gradually being filled up, but probably rather slowly, and that's sort of Europe's own self-defense. How do you see those two buckets, if you like, the image, filling up or draining out, and the sort of the relative levels?
First is that I think I am probably one of those people who would slightly push back at the suggestion that Trump and the current Republicans, well, Trump and the leadership around him are isolationist. I think they are way more transactional. The trend of criticism of European underspending is absolutely consistent across administrations. He's just blunter about it. And I think they are genuinely interested in the potential for a clash or the need to confront and ideally deter China, and that requiring a larger reallocation of US power. So I don't think it's necessarily isolationist. But I do think there is way less attachment to Europe as partners and allies. I think we should draw some comfort that he hasn't precipitately, if you like, pulled out of NATO yet. But I think people patting themselves on the back or celebrating the NATO summit, I think, are probably confusing summit management for a genuine policy change. The decision announced, but not yet enacted so far as I'm aware, to sell more equipment to Europe that can then be given to Ukraine is welcome, because that is a new outlet for supporting Ukraine. But it still means that Europe will have to spend a lot, and there's very little chance they can compensate for the reduction that's coming in US aid. So I think what is setting the scene for a Europe that is expecting to still have some kind of US involvement, but absolutely needs to step up. I think we should say, if there is a problem in the Indo-Pacific, it's not really US ground power, the US army in Europe, that is likely to be reallocated. It is the overwhelmingly airborne capabilities, long-range strike capabilities that will really make the difference in the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah.
And that is what we need to be aware of. And that's why, if Europe is going to spend more on defence, which it claims it will, it needs to take a hard look at the areas where it currently has a significant dependency on the US and begin to invest in its own capabilities. That's airborne surveillance, it's command and control, it is weapons stockpiles across the board, but also air-to-ground missiles and the ability to suppress Russian air defences, or notional adversary air defences, but we mean Russia. Because those are the areas that will be potentially most significantly affected by a US switch. And then it's got to practice thinking about and operating at a higher level of warfare. And by that I mean, this question of command and control, where in the NATO structures that we have, the people who think big, who have experience of commanding and coordinating tens and tens of thousands of troops, if not hundreds of thousands, are mostly US officers. The core for land warfare, the land level, very large collections of aircraft, very large naval formations. In large part, those are US officers who think and do that. You'll find lots of Brit deputies there, but we have to step up. So that's, I think, why we and the French have both committed to lead core level forces under the new NATO regional response plans, because we need to step up in terms of our familiarity with thinking about commanding that sort of force.
Yeah. So perhaps for listeners who've got less of the technical knowledge, can you sort of spell out what a core level force is? What scale are we talking about, and how challenging is that if you were talking about where the British Army is at the moment, which, as we both know, is tiny, basically?
So there are lots of these sort of, archaic sounding formations.
Yeah.
And I can talk about very handfuls about how big it would be. But you have, a battalion would be, 850 people. It's a force that would probably be specialised in a particular type of warfare. So they'd all be mechanised infantry who drive around in armoured vehicles or something like that. So you would try and, ideally, if you were going to fight a proper war, you would want to be deploying at least a brigade. Yeah. And that could be anywhere between a very skinny brigade, 3,000 or 4,000, up to a really chunky brigade, 8,000. And that's if you put in all of your tanks, your artillery, your logistics, your support vehicles. And then you take 2 or really 3 brigades and you create a division. And we used to say the division was the real kind of the fighting level, because that's the first point at which you bring together everything that you need to fight at the ground level and coordinate with your air partners and other capabilities. And you would have a large selection of artillery on which to draw on, commanded at the division level. And you might find a really big, a division is 15 to 20,000 people. And so you're talking, when we invaded Iraq, we were operating with the land component was, a big chunky division. I think it was larger in the Gulf War, but when we did Iraq in 2003, I think the land component was 25,000 or something like that. Yeah. When you're doing a corps, you are gluing together two divisions. Yeah. And at the corps level now, you have access to everything, and you're linking up to the national level. I mean, some of this is a bit sophistry, because as we've shrunk, we kind of move functions around. We maintain a core level headquarters for NATO, the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps, which the UK runs and leads.
Which is very near my home in Gloucestershire.
Indeed. And so you might be looking at now 35 to 40,000 people. Okay, so that's a lot of people now. And we used to maintain a corps in Germany during the Cold War, which I think was close to 50,000. What does that really mean for us? Well, at the moment, it is pretty much the totality of the deployable... Well, this is the totality of the combat bit of the British Army. The whole British Army at the moment is 72 to 73,000 people. Field Army is, I think, 45,000 plus.
But the important point there is that in real life, you couldn't possibly deploy those 40,000 people at once. So there's no way that Britain could deploy a corps at present.
The moment, no, because first of all, we don't have enough people trained at enough level of readiness. We don't have the equipment. So we are supposed to, at the moment, to be able to deploy a division. And if you scratch beneath the surface, it would take us several months to do that, which is kind of fair enough. High readiness forces are always much smaller. But we don't think that division would actually have all of the bridging equipment it needs, the ability to breach minefields. We would need a massive investment in artillery and all of these other support functions. And what Britain has therefore signed up to do is deploy a force about twice the size of the force that we currently can't deploy.
Right.
So we've set ourselves a genuinely significant challenge. And that is what the British Army is currently grappling with, at the same time as they are trying to significantly improve their combat power. Basically, how can they be more effective? And the current Chief of the General Staff has said, by 2027, we're going to double our firepower. He does have some ways of doing that, but the scale of the challenge is significant.
Yeah. Very significant. When we look at that, and of course, Britain, it's a pretty poor show, we might say, but Britain has spent quite a lot on its military relative to some other NATO partners. And if we're still focusing on this point about what can Europe do, if you make an assumption that America is largely not going to be involved, or certainly be much less involved than it was in the past. If we were to talk about the German army or the Italian army, or, I don't know, the Polish army perhaps is different because I know that they have expanded their expenditure. But when you start to add together those building blocks of European NATO members, how does that picture start to look in terms of the gap between objective and current reality?
So this is where you have different countries in NATO moving at different speeds. In truth, some of us are catching up in terms of investment. The Baltic states and Poland have already been spending much larger proportions of their GDP. So not larger in absolute cash terms.
There's smaller economies, but
much larger in terms of GDP terms. And have been getting a particular return. I mean, the UK would say we've still got very capable air forces, but they've been shrinking. We've still got good naval forces, but they're shrinking, and we have a real problem with crewing all the ships. Part of the reason we're focusing on land is because we recognise we have underperformed in land. And it's an important political as well as capability commitment to demonstrate that we're not going to be Albion sitting in an island behind our moat pretending that we are safe. Because we wouldn't be safe. We would just be temporarily safer. So what you have is Poland, which now has a very large army, way more tanks than us. They still believe in armour, but are looking at other things. The Baltic states have, a total defence model, and as do others. We have several hundred E5s across Europe coming online. That's a very potent air force. There's a Nordic Air Alliance where they formally committed to coordinating their air power in a way that really means they will be very effective, we hope, if it comes to conflict. On paper, Europe actually has a decent range of capabilities. It's just got to reduce its dependencies. The caveats there are we have some absolute backmarkers. So politically, we have trouble with, say, Hungary and the need for consensus in NATO and them wavering on certain issues. We have Spain spending a frankly pathetic amount on defence and not really being interested in committing to the funding target. They claim they can do it on capabilities. But Spain hosts Russian warships still. You've just seen an announcement about Spain accepting Huawei, of all people, into supporting some of their cybersecurity. You also have a problem of readiness. I think the Germans have made some big headlines on increasing defence spending, which has made people really sit up. But they know they have an enormous readiness problem. When they scratch beneath the surface on the German army in the past few years, not only is the land bit of the German armed forces small, I think smaller on paper than the British army, readiness in both their air force and their land forces was terrible. So they didn't have the right level of training, they didn't have the right level of deployability. What the force that they could actually put out in reality is woefully undersized and underpowered. So European defence investment has got to both begin to fill in the gaps in capability terms and get us up to speed as European countries so that we can operate.
Yeah. Now, an element of that is coming back to a point you made earlier, is there's certain capabilities that as sort of technical capabilities don't exist in Europe, made by Europeans. Is that a problem in your view? Is it okay for us to keep buying American stuff and operating it? Or do we need to start making inventing our own air surveillance or whatever it is? And if so, how is that going?
First thing is, I think it's unrealistic to completely divest from from US equipment. That's partly because essentially there's just not the capacity in Europe in terms of defence industry and the sophistication to replace absolutely everything. That's a non-starter. And in some cases, replacing capabilities will take years. The other thing is, I think it's politically unwise to completely divest from the US when that does provide some leverage. The cold, hard reality of European cash going into US defence firms is a degree of leverage. It creates a degree of entanglement. It prevents a total disengagement. So we've got to walk a fine line between saying we need to insulate ourselves against vulnerabilities and dependencies on the US, and we should completely militarily decouple from them. I just think that's, not only is it wildly unrealistic, it would actually be unwise. So what Europe has to do is expand capacity, create some redundancy, and then in some areas, yes, I think the term would probably be compete, but the point is create a domestic defence market in certain capability areas. And some of that might be a kind of compromise where you have US companies building stuff, but in Europe, at European factories. The Germans have just agreed, I think, a license to produce Patriot, which is a US system, in a factory in Germany. And that's a kind of a happy medium that keeps US involvement, but helps reduce European deficiencies.
So I guess then that rather leads us on, I think, to perhaps the final bit of this part of the discussion in terms of talking about nuclear deterrence. Obviously, there are two nuclear-armed states in Europe, France and Britain. It appears, I think, uncontroversial to say that France's system has greater sovereignty than the British one, but there is quite a lot of debate around, again, the idea not of kill switches, but the degree to which Britain is somewhat dependent on the US to operate its deterrent. So I suppose, starting there, many people will know that the warheads are ours, the missiles are, I think, leased technically, but obviously they're American missiles, and the maintenance on those is done by Americans. But also, of course, guidance, the satellite networks that you need to guide these weapons, again, is reliant on the Americans. So what would be your concerns when we talk about nuclear deterrence at a European level? So I'm talking about UK and France in terms of our resilience going forward.
Both French and British nuclear deterrents are operationally sovereign and independent. That is, they decide how they would use them on a national basis. The French is entirely sovereign in that they build and produce it and maintain it. We, as you have mentioned, make some savings in terms of we have jointly developed the missiles and the new missile compartment that is going in the Dreadnought submarines, and we've made some savings there, and the missile stockpile. It's worth noting that we can operate them completely independently. They don't use GPS for guidance. It's a mixture of different guidance systems, but it's not a GPS weapon. If the US denied us access to the GPS signal, we couldn't target Trident. We absolutely could.
So that's an important point, because I sometimes hear people speculate about that once the missile is launched, America can't stop it, basically.
No, absolutely not. So, but the point is that we would need to find somewhere to put the missile stockpile if they ever switched off that access, and we spend money, etc., etc. So they're both operationally independent. I think, again, if we got into a situation where US defence industry was refusing to maintain that, like, we would be in a genuinely game-changing world. I don't think that's on the cards at the moment. It is something we should think about down the line, though. There are a number of areas where the UK has benefited enormously from its relationship with the US. Nuclear is one, intelligence is the other. And we've made enormous savings by piggybacking on US systems, space-based detection systems, space-based surveillance. We haven't until recently had no space-based surveillance satellites, which might come as a surprise to people. The French have a small constellation. We don't. Why not? Because we're part of the Five Eyes Alliance, and we provide analytical power into that, analysts and researchers, and therefore we get access to US space-based surveillance, which if we had to buy that, there have been various estimates made over the years, but we had the head of UK Space Command in recently, and their estimate is we might have to pay £3 or £4 billion a year if we were actually paying for that imagery. So that's a huge saving we've made. Now, we've started to launch our own network, our own constellation, and that is because we actually realised we do need something that is sovereign, or as he called it, nationally separable. In other words, we can do something on our own, and we will expand that over the next few years. Whether or not we'd want to do something like that on nuclear missiles down the line is open to question. But a good example of an area where we are trying to strike out as the UK in the lead with others is on GCAP, the Global Combat Aircraft Programme, where we are somewhat ambitiously attempting to create what we're calling a sixth generation combat aircraft. But what we really mean is we're going to develop a stealth aircraft where we're in the lead, like the US is on the lead on F-35, and we'll do it in some other countries. And that is both of industrial benefit to the UK aerospace sector and of a operational and sovereignty benefit in terms of the UK's ability to not be beholden to others.
Let's sort of move on to the final part of this discussion, where in this podcast we talk about disorder, and here then we would like to talk about ordering the disorder and ways in which we can bring more order to this disordered world. And obviously a lot of what we're talking about is the basic point here is clearly there are considerable security risks in the current sort of geopolitical space, notably in Europe, with a major war underway and other tensions clearly evident. And obviously, again, there is a consensus that Europe needs to do more on defence, and the argument is about how much and when, but the consensus exists that there needs to do more. But I wonder, is there a bigger question here? Because we both have a background in UK government service. Over the years, there was a sort of cross-channel different perspective, where the French took a view that you had to have a level of separateness, a level of independence in the way that your military and security policies operate. And of course, at some times, they even took themselves out of NATO's military command. And you've just given us a really good exposition of how that differs in the nuclear space. But maybe as we're looking at sort of how to order the disorder, could we say that the French were right all along, and actually Britain was mistaken in kind of throwing in its lot with an ally who ultimately has other interests in other parts of the world?
Were the French right all along? I think to a degree, their long-term bet that Europe needs to have what they called, strategic autonomy or sovereignty. Yes, they were right. If by that you mean Europe needs the capacity to act in its own right, independent of the US. And the US have been saying that for some time. I don't think that means that the UK position of, we'd like to kind of work with both, was necessarily wrong. I mean, the UK has got enormous benefit strategically from positioning itself right in the centre of a Venn diagram that includes the Five Eyes, NATO, previously the EU, bilateral relationships with the US, smaller multilateral organisations like the Joint Expeditionary Force, observer status in something that's Indo-Pacific focused like ASEAN, being part of the Five Power Defence Arrangements, the FPDA, which is Indo-Pacific focused. We are at the heart of a number of networks. I think the UK being part of multiple networks has been of enormous benefit. I think what happened, though, was we became blind to the dependencies that we have created in a number of cases. And then, when the US became less politically reliable, and I think it's fair to say it is less politically reliable now, we were suddenly left acutely aware. So I think if you wish to order the disorder, Europe is waking up to, it's all very well to talk about strategic autonomy. You've got to invest to do that. And I think that's hard to do when you invest well. It's doubly hard when you haven't. And I think for all of the chat from the French and others about this, we're seeing right now, in many cases, Europe is kind of impotent. The US, as a power, finds it hard enough to operate everywhere at once. So that era of, if you want to call it US hegemony, but the unipolar moment is past. The US needs partners and allies. It gains enormous benefit from partners and allies. It is a huge advantage over Russia and China. People will work with Russia and China. They can be bought by Russia and China. There aren't that many countries that actively like them. The US has countries that like working with it, and that's a benefit up until now. I think that's what's at risk with a more transactional US approach. And in truth, Europe needs to wake up to the fact that similar levels of investment as a whole, not matching US defence spending, the US spends nearly $1 trillion on defence, but Europe doing more involves spending more, investing more, and working together. I think that's, in truth, the big challenge. Europe is going to have to compromise across the board. And in many respects, we see countries that talk a good game on coordination not liking it when they have to sacrifice direct interests. We've got a big problem with investment from China, where countries talk about China as a security threat and then don't do anything about it. Europe, I think, in the past 12 months has spent more money on buying Russian energy than it has spent on aid to Ukraine. That's bananas, frankly, and there's still a way to go.
Well, Matthew, that feels like a really good place to conclude this discussion. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your insights with us on the Disorder Show.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Disorder Podcast, presented by me, Arthur Snell, in partnership with RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. Thanks for listening, and I hope you have an orderly week. And if you're on holiday at this time of year, an orderly trip. Goodbye.